you linked to something on Six Colors that I thought was interesting, and it was you linked to an article about an article. I want to give a bit of backstory so we can talk about it. So, in iOS 18, Apple has created a new privacy prompt for sharing contacts with an app. So usually, like in the past, I should say, you could, an app could say, would you like to share your contacts? You just say, okay, and it's done. So it used to be incredibly easy. But now, this privacy prompt works similarly to the photos permission, where you get asked if you want to share contacts, and then you get asked for which, and you can either share everything or you can do that thing where you just choose some specific contacts. So basically, Apple has made it much harder for a developer to get that like blanket forever permission that they can scan and use all of your contacts for whatever they want. So this prompt will also, I'm sure, make people consider how they're sharing their contacts, or they'll just forget about it and not do it. Therefore, it will control how developers get to scrape contacts for bootstrapping apps, usually social apps. The New York Times, I think Kevin Roos at the New York Times wrote an article claiming that this process would mean kind of the end of new social apps, because there have been many instances over the years of social apps being able to get started by using or abusing the contacts that people had on their phones, which I think the conceit of that I actually agree with, but it seemed like that the article was kind of making these claims and trying to back them on information that they were not sharing, if that makes sense. Like, it was like, oh, I spoke to such and such person and they said this. But like, I feel like as an opinion piece, this maybe would have been better, but it doesn't really seem to have been positioned as such. This article prompted Nick here to write an article of their own, basically defending users with this, rather than the startups trying to invade the privacy of those users, which the New York Times piece seems to, for some reason, lean more towards, which then made you link to this in Six Colors, talking about the idea of Apple being like Godzilla, which I liked, where Apple can kind of just, in its way, stomp on a building and change everything.
Right, everything. So yeah, there's all these layers here. So I think Kevin Roos's piece, I don't like it. I think that it is way too worried about a growth hacking startup bro who is sad that he can't quickly build a startup by strip mining everybody's contacts. And there's still apps that do this too, where it's like, if you want to join remember Clubhouse? Clubhouse is like, if you want to join Clubhouse, you have to share all of your contacts with us so that we can spam all your contacts and we can build a social graph. And it's actually kind of amazing that Apple has taken this long to take its approach that it's done elsewhere and do it to this, which is selectively sharing. Instead of it being like, we empower you to not share anything, it's like, we empower you to share whatever you want to and nothing more, not your entire contacts list. And I'm even leaving out the other thing, which is the consent of the people who gave you their contact information. I'm sure they didn't give you personally their contact information so that you could share it with everybody else, right? And yet, that's what's going on here. I feel like users are not just protecting their own information, they're protecting their contacts' information by doing this. So I think Kevin Roos's piece, exacerbated by a really bad headline, but even the piece is bad too, I think, which is, it seems very worried about, who will speak for the startup bros, and not about the fact that they are building businesses and getting investments and making profits and selling out and getting rich by selling people's information, right? That they're gleaning from this, from an app permission. So Nick Here's piece basically says, you got it backward. Apple makes this decision. We should look at it and say, wow, it's kind of crappy that the guys like this guy that's quoted in this article extensively have made a living starting up companies based on asking everybody to empty their address books and give all of their contacts away to this guy. And that it really should be the other way around. And so Nick Here's piece is headlined, "I do not care about impediments to a creepy growth hacking technique." Which is like, I think he's right. They got it all backward, and it shows you just how broken I think some writers on technology's minds are about the fact that they seem to be covering startups and not technology that impacts people. and that perhaps you should be more user-centric and a little less startup-centric. I mean, TechCrunch, I kind of understand it. It's kind of their business. But the New York Times, maybe not so much. I don't know. Maybe it is. But the point, and I was talking to Dan Morin last Friday, I guess, on the Six Colors podcast about this too. I think the thing that's most interesting to walk away from this whole thing is take just the fact that Apple made this decision. Isn't it interesting that Apple at this point is so big and so powerful, and the iPhone is so important, that any decision Apple makes has the potential to close off whole lines of potential new business. And we talked about this with like the App Store and App Store policy saying there'll never be an app that does this because everybody knows it'll just get rejected, and how Apple has that sort of power. But I'm saying, like, even if Apple is literally just thinking, oh, we did photos and we did files, and now we're going to do contacts with our new system that has an API, and the picker is separate from the app, so the app can't see your contacts, and then you can choose what to do, just like you can with files and photos. This is a new approach Apple's taking that allows apps to ask for stuff without needing to be granted license, right? You pick, you share. The app only sees the stuff you share. It never gets access to your library. And this year they're like, we brought it to contacts, and they do it at WWDC, and you think, great, of course you did. Like, why wasn't it already there?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I really am not making an argument here about this. I'm just saying it. When Apple does something like that, there are enormous ramifications almost every time. And that's the Godzilla metaphor, which is, maybe Godzilla just wants a sandwich, right? Godzilla's like, hey, little famished, gonna walk down to my favorite sandwich shop. But Godzilla's huge, and Godzilla's going to step on your car on the way there. And if Godzilla stepped on your car, you're like, oh my God, I hope I paid my insurance because I need a new car now. Godzilla stepped on it. That is Apple. Like Apple sometimes makes tactical decisions to change the world, right? Other times though, and I think that they're aware, I think there's awareness there, but I think other times Apple's like, well, no, we just did this because it makes sense technically, or it's a thing that we needed to do because we wanted to protect users against this thing, or we're rolling out our existing privacy framework to another part of the data store on the phone. It's not that big a deal, but like every move they make on the iPhone has potentially enormous ramifications to create markets, to destroy markets, to ruin people's companies, to make new companies.
Yeah.
And in that, I think that the original Kevin Roose piece is interesting because the guy's attitude is basically like, welp, I mean, again, a little more sympathetic to this guy than I would be, but his thought is like, well, I guess this one's run dry. I'll go on to the next opportunity.
Yeah.
And that is what Apple can do just at the drop of a hat, at just setting foot on the street. They will close something off and create something else. And I just think, as somebody who covered Apple back when it was irrelevant, it is interesting to think about that and think about what Apple thinks about it. Does Apple, every Apple move, presumably they're like, what will this do? What are the ramifications of this? But like, everything they do is like this now. Literally, Apple cannot make a change without it having a substantial impact on people or businesses or something out there because of their sheer scale.
One that I always think of with this is app tracking transparency. Where, Apple,
Absolutely.
For whatever reason, Apple decided that they would make it much harder for developers, companies, advertisers, ad marketplaces, that thing, to be able to track users and serve them ads. And in doing that, I mean, for a lot of companies in tech and social media and that kind of stuff, there was the pre-ATT and the post-ATT.
Yeah.
Like I was listening to something recently where they were talking about Snapchat. And it's like, well, Snapchat, they made money in like one quarter, and then never again because that tracking transparency came in. Like they'd finally kind of nailed their advertising system and then gone away again. And it's one of these things where it's like, I agree with the idea around trying to give people a choice for their privacy, but it's just a peculiar thing where one company has the ability to change the fortunes of so many other businesses. Because,
Right.
It's easy to focus on the Snapchats and Facebooks of the world, but there are lots of stories of, companies that were building their businesses, selling ads on different platforms, and it's
Right.
become much harder for them now post
So
this.
the challenge, there's a lot of complexity here, but the challenge is Apple didn't make it so that you can't track people.
No.
And Apple didn't make it so you can't share contacts with apps.
Mm-hmm.
What Apple did is make them ask or give users more ability to choose what the scope of their sharing is. And we can argue that, and I actually would argue that I think Apple hasn't nailed that give user scope thing, and that it gets in my way more than I would like as a user. And maybe some of this is the way that the individual apps handle this, but like when I try to share an image in Slack and it's like, oh, currently you're sharing the last 5 images that you shared in Slack. Do you want to pick from those? It's like, well, of course I don't. I want to pick from my library, and it makes me go and add it to the list and then add it through. And it's like, well, that's not how that should work. And I'm not quite sure who's at fault there. But the bigger point is, it's not like you can't build a business based on your social graph, but you've got to convince the users that it's worth sharing your social graph or part of your social graph with a random company. And you have to make the case. And you have to make the case, in the case of ATT, you have to make the case that you want to be tracked. And people don't. And I know that can be self-serving for Apple, because Apple considers itself the first party, so it can track you on its devices for its purposes, and that's fine because they're not selling it to anybody else or using it themselves for anything other than their existing things, which is you already agreed to. You're using an Apple phone, your knowledge is their knowledge, and right, it's like a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And arguably that's unfair, right? But and I know it got brought up like, oh, but what about messages? Messages uses your contacts, and mail uses your contacts. And are they going to ask about that? And I guess what I would say is maybe they should, right? Maybe Apple the first time, and it's going to be annoying, but if you want to be fair about it, maybe Apple, when you open messages for the first time, it should say, hey, do you want Apple, all your contacts to be available in messages? And here's what will happen is people will say yes to that. People will say yes to that.
See, I am of the belief that they should ask, because Apple is making assumptions about the trust people have in them.
Right.
Or why does a user why does someone who buys an iPhone, why do they they're inherently I'll just give it to Apple and not WhatsApp, when WhatsApp might be what they trust and use implicitly,
The difference is you are putting that information into your phone, which means that it's in your Apple kind of system. And when you add somebody to messages, it's not leaving your phone, really. Whereas what these apps are doing is saying, we would like to read your contacts and copy them off your device. Arguably, and again, this is one of those cases where you could make a differentiation here, which is there's access to the contact information and there's copying your contacts list and putting it on someone's server, right? And those could arguably be different. But once the app's got them, anything goes. But so I would say there's on device and there's also off device, and there's implicit trust with Apple. And yeah, I guess my argument would be if people really trust Snap or something, then should they have an address book in their app that's not the contacts and keep it there? I mean, Google has its own contacts that are not Apple contacts, and they do it that way.
Yeah,
it's one of those things where the problem is sometimes I think Apple does this in very self-serving ways because they are damaging competitors while they still have an advantage. But also, this is the complexity of it, and this is why whenever anybody says, "Oh, Apple just says that they care about user privacy, but they really just want them all to yourself," and I hate those arguments because. It is not true. The reverse is also not true, right? This is when we talked about all the issues about Apple and its security and privacy stance and how the EU says that some of it is bogus. It's like look, it is part of Apple's corporate belief. It is also a place where Apple has an advantage. And that's what makes it muddy, is I don't believe Apple is limiting contacts to destroy tech bro startups so that they can control your social graph for their own nefarious purposes inside Apple. I don't think that's why. I think Apple literally is looking at that and saying, it's kind of gross that right now people are asked one thing and they get complete access to the contacts. Mm-hmm. That's too much. So what you could argue is that the growth hacker guy, his whole business was based on Apple making a naive technical decision a few years ago. Because remember, what it was is they were siphoning all of the contacts out. And so Apple put in a permission to stop it. But it was a yes-no permission. And now Apple's saying, let's be a little more granular about this permission. So it used to be that the way your business model was to get people to say yes. So Clubhouse was like, you can't use Clubhouse unless you give us everybody you know, and then we'll let you in the door, right? So you say yes, and then we got you. Okay, now you can come in the door. And Apple said, well, that's not great. Maybe we need to make it so that like if you want to use Clubhouse, you can share like 5 people, or Clubhouse is gone, but that idea. So you could argue that like Growth Hacker Bro, like he was taking advantage of an inefficiency and a sort of a naivety about Apple that has now gone away. And so that's why his attitude, I think, is actually pretty good, which is, okay, they close that loophole, on to the next thing. What will I exploit next in order to make my businesses go? And again, I mean, I'm a little judgmental about that, but at the same time, like, that's business. Like, that's just how it goes. I don't think Apple is out to destroy him per se, especially for their own benefit. I think Apple looks at that and says, yeah, that's gross. Users shouldn't be forced to make that decision. We should give users more control of their data and choose where to use it. And I do think that's where they're coming from. But the fact that they benefit from things like app tracking transparency because they have personalized data in the App Store based on what you do, and they can use it because they're the first party, muddies the waters, right? It makes you question every decision they make, because are they doing this to gain an advantage, or are they doing this to protect us? And the answer sometimes is yes to both.
Yes.
And sometimes it's not. But in this case, it's funny, and this is why I think it's important. It's funny that it's gotten to the point where even if Apple makes what I would say is a fairly straightforward judgment about user control of their data and privacy, people are still going to say, I can't believe Apple is doing this. And that's the Godzilla thing, right? Like, through no fault of their own necessarily, trying to do something positive, they can still do a lot of damage. And they may know that they're going to do it and not care. They may not know.